A lot I'm gonna say about Treaty 2, it'll become like a combination of what is shared, I guess, in written word and oral tradition. I've been blessed to hear the stories of elders that talks about treaties, and it's a lot of it. A lot of it has happened to be not recorded. So I'll give you a little background on myself and how this journey started a long time ago when it came to treaty history. I almost went to the colonial history, which impacts my people, but we're not going there today. What we're going to talk about is, as a young man, as a band manager of Skowhegan First Nation, in the mid-90s, we gathered at Lake Manitoba First Nation. And the topic was sovereignty, treaties and sovereignty. And back in those days, treaties wasn't really a topic that was always present. But in this day, it did. And I met Dennis Whitebird. I met him a few times through ceremonies, and he was part of West Region Tribal Council. But what really changed the path in my life was I met a researcher, a well-respected researcher on behalf of all First Nations when it comes to history and treaties. And his name was Roy Hawkowitz. And he was sharing his research because he's always looking for more and more to fit all the narrative. And then we got to know each other. We talked, because I was already a historian for my people back home in Skowhegan. I was raised by my grandparents. So I was raised by elders, because people talk, they share. And I heard all the stories. So that what formulated eventually a historical timeline that I'll put together was mostly based on oral tradition, from the stories of our people. But going back to Roy Hawkowitz, now we're talking about treaties. He did his presentation on treaties. And he said that's the one thing that was missing in the story of Canada. And I would launch with any group on saying, how did Canada become a country in the first place? And it was the foundation that built this country from coast to coast to coast. And it's still in current development even to this day. It will be 100% one day. But the foundation, and supported by our laws of the land, that this country is built on treaties. And to connect from one coastline to another to build we call it a medicine line because it was a very important line to us to safeguard our own sovereignty against the Americans, the long knives. And how many times that played out throughout history in terms of defending these lands. It later on became the Jay Treaty and Oregon Treaty that made it into an international border, but the Anishinaabeg is on both sides of those borders. In fact, when I start talking about treaties, there are 11 numbered treaties that we focus on primary here. In Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, or Saulteaux, or sometimes we have different names across the nations like Mississaugas and Algonquins and so forth. Of the numbered treaties, 7 out of 11 is Anishinaabe. We're quite vast in our numbers. We just have different dialects. But we ended up being on a majority of those treaties. So there's a lot of little history like that when we talk about these things. So from that time, from 1995 and onwards, I was starting to put it all together. With the help of my late mentor, Roy Hawkwitz, he started sharing all his research with me. We had a lifelong friendship. So I tip my hat off to him if I was wearing a hat today, because he's always in my thoughts. But he had a tremendous impact with all the other First Nations throughout this country. To give them the foundation of when things get buried in history with legal documents and legislation and laws, they're just there to be dug out and put together. And I just want you to let you know that whatever is buried we can relearn what is the truth in the making of our country. So anyway, that's where I'm going to depend on some notes to guide me. I normally do PowerPoint. I'm just putting together, trying to keep the narrative together. There we go. So if you see me reading, it's okay, please forgive me, but I'll be filling in some gaps, including the fact that when it comes to peace and friendship treaties, and I have to say that Treaty 1 and 2 is a peace and friendship treaty, because it doesn't go into any details about natural resources and the wealth of the land. It was very simple. Strangers show up. They come into the territories. Can we live with you? And when it comes to our differences in terms of our worldview and our association to Mother Earth, ours is that we are not owners of the land. We don't put fences on the land. But we do identify with each other because we're so diverse as nations that we have territories and shared territories, and we made treaties along the way. And the goal is to try to live with each other as neighbors. So the stereotype all along was that we're just a bunch of savages that are constantly at war with each other. You know, that highlights into Western movies. And that is not our history. But Canadians grew up with the content that, you know, you had John Wayne movies, and then you had Bonanza and Gunsmoke and Little House on the Prairie, and then it ends up being saying, oh, the pioneers had made this country, when it's far from the truth. Because if you don't have the proper narrative being taught in schools, you don't know the truth. So there was a blind spot in our Canadian history for the longest time. Even Pierre Berton, you know, romanticized the railroad and Confederacy, but it misses out the most important component. The country was built on treaties. That's the foundation of Canada. And just a little side note, reason why there's a Treaty Relations Commission in Manitoba, that this had to be addressed, this blind spot. And to work with organizations and school divisions and schools and all Manitobans to learn that we were all treaty people. And there was a little bit of a misunderstanding, because even our own people would bring up the fact that they don't have treaties, we have treaties. Who's they? Canadians. It takes two parties to make a treaty. That's why we call ourselves Canadians. You're a party to treaty. And new Canadians that come here, they got to learn this, that you're a treaty person. That's why we do land acknowledgements, to acknowledge the fact of all the nations that were in any given place were nations. In time, led to reconciliation. Now we're going into 10 plus years, and it's not going to stop, because education in this country will not be complete as far as a historian and many observers will all agree. As long as this country has an Indian Act, there is no reconciliation. Because my ancestors had made treaty. The Indian Act basically says I'm Indian status. What it really means, I'm a ward of Canada. It goes back to Confederacy and Section 9124 that basically, as a new governing body under the North American Act, the government basically says we govern over the Indians and their lands. Without any treaty, without any First Nations present, it was contrary to what the Queen at the time wanted, because at that time in 1860, it was a lot of things going on, including the fact that the United States, they just finished their Civil War in 1864. Now their interest is to go and send Little House of the Prairie, go west. If you get in any trouble, we'll come and use these armed forces that we had in the Civil War. Go west, young man, go west. And then it's all about the land grab. They did make treaties too, about 50 of them. Every single one was broken because it was used as a means to round up all the Indians to reservation. And if you're one of them that's just trying to hang on to your territory and your ancestral land, and you're not on a reservation, then you're the enemy of the state. So legal genocide was that we could kill you. So anyway, I'm a historian of trying to figure out what's the mindset of all these laws and regulations, and I look at the era. But Canada was different. Started off on the East Coast, peace and friendship. It was contrary to the views since the time of Columbus that the people were actually human beings. At first we weren't even human beings. Indians were considered in these lands in the New World as akin to nature, not quite human. It took another pope to proclaim that there are people that are actually human beings, but they don't have a Christian God. So moving forward through all that narrative, that history, it all became about the land and Christianity converting. So when you look at the history of the Red River history, the valley itself, it's still the same theme. Let's save their souls, but we need their land. So I'm going to talk about the founding fathers that were threatened by what was going on in the United States. And once again, they just bought Alaska, so they now want a corridor again to expand outward. There are 4 separate times that I can think of that they tried to annex what we'll eventually call Canada, Rupert's Land and Northwest Territories. And here they are, they want to do it again. Now, if it wasn't for our treaty relationships as allies, we've all been under Trump. But once again, we fight for our sovereignty, we fight for our rights, and we have elbows up. It unites us to do that we would always defend the true North and free. So once again, it's the treaties that save us. Just like the treaties that save us when Quebec wants to separate. They can vote all they want, but the foundation was always a treaty arrangement. Then Alberta doesn't abide by a federal law duty to consult and accommodate. But bottom line, it's treaty territory. So you can vote all you want. In the end, it's protected under the Constitution of Treaty and Aboriginal rights. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that we as Canadians should have a lot of respect and pride and how we are so independent that ties us to the land together, and we're all treaty people. So when they went to see the Queen, give us those lands, and Rupert's land, Northwest Territories, give us those lands. We want to be a country. We no longer want to be colonies. And Queen Victoria had to say, sorry, those are not our lands. Her grandfather, King George, had set up the Royal Proclamation of 1761. I'm starting to lose the dates a little bit. Anyway, I think I'm on track. The Royal Proclamation is basically, I recognize that you are all nations. I recognize your sovereignty. I recognize these are your lands. And we want to be partners. We want to be allies. So if we want to do business with you, set up the forts, trading posts, or we formally make a treaty, it was outlined. Must be done in public. Everybody got to know about it. No deceit. You give and take. And you have to be compensated. So it was all set up that way. So the Queen Victoria says, did you do that? And they said, no. Well, she said, we didn't conquer them, even though the British might at the time was a superpower and it was basically colonizing the world, but not in Canada. Not in Rupert's Land and Northwest Territories. Those are our allies. Did you do that? And they said, no. Well, you do it my way. And then that's when a mistake took place. The treaties are with the Crown. And that time, Queen Victoria had a sign that the treaties that you're going to negotiate for be under my name. Now, she didn't use the British, the Crown itself. She used the New Canadians. So it's like inviting the fox to come into the house of the hens and the chickens and say, hey, let's make a treaty. It was predictable that this is not going to turn out well because they had other interests. To create a country from coast to coast, but get any way you can to get a signature. Get an agreement. Because they already had plans with the British North American Act and later on the Gradual Civilization Act that was prior to that, but now they're already starting to formulate the Indian Act to turn us from partners of nation building to become a ward of Canada. So it started off by being simple, that the treaties is to open up the land for immigration. But it doesn't talk about the wealth. It doesn't talk about the harvest of wood and minerals. There's a lot of that was going on prior to Treaty 1. In Ontario, they had, Ojibwe was known for their copper mines. And everywhere they go, you need wood for steamboats. And so there was a traditional practice of leaving behind some payment. Everybody practiced that because that was kind of the protocol during the fur trade. Now we're talking about events. And they try to make this treaty, and Treaty 1 was supposed to be in what we call Ontario today. And the Ojibwe says, well, think about it. We'll think about it, which is wise. Why rush into this? There was a lot of ceremonies by old traditions. There was a lot of shaking hands and what we call Madudu Sun, sweat lodges, and ceremonies is asking the ancestors, shall we do this? It's not an easy question. So when they said no, but we'll allow you to come through with your forces, because there was troubles in the Red River. And Luriel had to go and save his life by going to the United States. Lot of conversations to talk about the history, like the Orange Men, the Orange the Protestants movement. So they went to Lower Fort Garry. In late July, you had the likes of Wyman Simpson, who was going to be designated as Indian Commissioner, but who was really pulling all the strings here and trying to form that first draft of a treaty was Adam Archibald. And they probably met in the big house, you know, with Scottish Métis interpreter, McKay, and many others, on what's the approach to this. Now, the word went out to make treaty, and the Anishinaabeg wanted treaty because they knew what was going on in the United States. They knew the troubles are coming. They also made a treaty with between the Ojibwe and Dakota to come back home over the Grand Medicine line. And they started showing up at Fort Alice, and that was here. That treaty was brokered by the Métis so that they can be safe. They came back on their traditional land. Dakota did. So there is a treaty in place, but the Crown or Canada does not recognize it. We can make treaty at any time because we're still a nation. We're still sovereign in our minds. I keep on saying, well, let's put this to practice. Let's do a treaty with Iceland and protect them from Trump. Well, anyway, so when we get to the events of Treaty 1, it's well documented. There was 2 major newspapers covering the events. A lot of witnesses, church groups, Hudson Bay employees, settlers alike. There was a lot of interest in it. And I usually speak quite a bit about Treaty 1, of all the events that take place, starting on June 27 and concluding on August 3rd. Now, I worked at Lower Fort Garry for 9 years, and that's where I really tapped into the experts like Gene Friesen and a lot of elders from Treaty 1 that have their oral traditions and research, and authors when it comes to treaties. So I keep in August 3rd, I keep inviting them to come and speak about treaties, because Canada do not know the meaning of treaty. Treaty is a national home at Lower Fort Garry. So it was Treaty Relations Commission says, why don't you go and teach them? I was independent. I didn't need a job. So last minute, sure, why not? And on my first day when I walked through, there was a plaque in front that says seated. And I went inside and I said, how can you put that out there when it's a big lie? And this is a national home of treaty. Your narrative is all wrong. It's one-sided. But when I find out that they were actually trying to change that plaque, and maybe I was the 3rd one or the 4th one, just take out the simple word seated, Justice Canada steps in and says, you can't do that. Anyway, recent events, I was just there on August 3rd, and the superintendent says, because I knew they took it out, they put it in the warehouse. Might as well, out of sight, out of mind, I guess. But he said the official stand with us, he says, that we were just about to change it. Canada didn't step in. Just that Treaty 1 didn't finish the job. It was an elder that was going to look at it, and he didn't come back. I don't know what happened, but it's still waiting. So it should get complete. So anyway, back to the narrative. I want to talk about Treaty 2. And Treaty 2 was a lot of controversies from those elders that said, like Yellow Quill is midday. A lot of midday is in the south, going west, even in the east. Meanwhile, the Red River area was starting to lose its midday connection. But even when they try to show their force, when they showed up with shooting cannons, and they're showing their uniforms, and the warriors were everywhere to keep the peace, making sure there's no conflict. That scared the local bands because they're not practicing that anymore. This is critical because that's tradition. The ceremonies, the shaking tents, even enforcing nobody goes west past Lake Manitoba was enforced because they knew that people were just trying to cross over and creating conflicts, American traders with alcohol, and the warriors are going to make sure that, okay, we're going to keep the peace ourselves. But later on, because of treaties, the promise was, when you come onto our territory and our lands, we are the law. Now, when we go into your lands, and as it develops into towns and townships and so forth, we'll abide by your laws. That's an agreement. So later on, when they left on the west gate of Lower Fort Garry to go west to enforce protection, but later on, the enforcement of the law turned against the First Nations themselves. And that was the promise that we will not interfere in the laws of Canada. We kept our promises, but we lost the ability to push back by keeping our promises to keep the peace. Because we made the promise to the Crown, Queen Victoria. We will not go to war because we've been allies for so long. We never knew that Canadians are going to use laws against us even to this very day. So that's why we have a place like this center, to give you more insight. Because there was a time that lawyers will never learn about treaties or deep into those oral traditions. I had friends who became lawyers. They're no longer with us. Those earlier lawyers. And when they showed up to learn to be a lawyer, the topic wasn't even there. But they did create their own association to bring it in to the body. So not to get so much into the treaty, it was controversial, and I'll say this. They immediately said, let's split them up in the late June. He said, there's too much. So they ended up by, later on, it was 5 at first, but then there was adjacent treaties to appease the yellow quill. They spread it out to become Sandy Bay, Long Plains, and Swan Lake, Swan River, Swan Lake. Do they have a lake? Anyway. But it was a lot of promises that were made in those events, and they didn't end up being recorded. They were in a journal of Adam Archibald. He was doodling and he was putting it down. They want an ox. He drew an ox. So that was captured. So what ended up being was Treaty 2 was also there. Meekus and many others were there because they thought it was going to be one big treaty. It was too much. So they did a treaty that was on the east side of Lake Manitoba, and there'll be treaties on the west side of Lake Manitoba. And they said, we'll split them up. So they made that decision right away. But they were present. Ojibwe was present everywhere. There was representatives that will eventually become Treaty 3 were present at Lower Fort Garry. Everybody from the south came over. There was no boundary. They just came over and saying, okay, what's going on? So those events was even Dakota came on the other side of the Red River with the promise that they too will have a chance to talk about getting their own treaty. But everybody would agree that to this very day, it's still unknown. There are parts that are missing, but the ones who are filling the gap are the oral tradition of Roseau River, Roseau Rapids, Long Plains, and many, many other that kept it alive for every time they have treaty days. There was an oral tradition by recounting what happened at Lord Fort Garry, what was the promises. And it kept it alive to where here it's now captured in volumes by the elders. Getting back to, it was because the representatives were here, and Mikas was here, and many others, they says, come now, come to Manitoba House, come to Kennesoda, the Hudson Bay Post, and we'll formalize a treaty. Now, Mikas was a spokesperson for that area. Not everybody showed up, including the fact where I'm from Skowhegan, and we had a representative called Broken Fingers, Morris Broken Fingers. We joke about it. He ain't supposed to represent us, so he broke his fingers. I don't know if it's factual or not. But anyway, he represented a lot of those First Nations that goes past Ochichakasipi. So eventually, what was signed was 7, but there was many. This is we're not represented here. This is our territory, and you gave away the vast portion of the territory without us. So my people try to correct that. So there was a lot of adjacent treaties to correct a lot of things, like promises that were made, oral traditions that were made, combination of what was said here in Treaty 1, what was said in Treaty 2, what was said in Treaty 3. So there's a lot of added-ons. Now the thing about Treaty 2, if you look at it, there's a lot of First Nations that are in our territory. It becomes things there was mistakes. You excluded some communities, some First Nations in that territory. But then there are some that were left out when they made Treaty 4, but they're still in our territory. But they're not officially now part of Treaty 2. They're Treaty 4 in the Treaty 2 territory. Same thing with Dakota. Dakota, there was that agreement that was made here, but they came home. They're in Treaty 2 territory, but they're not recognized by the Crown, by the government. Even though they would get King George medals by defending Canada with the events that the Americans and so forth, they played a central role defending their old territory. This is their territory. And then the events that took place with, they forgot about Fisher River. They took the Muskegos, Swampy Cree, from this area, and they started pushing them out of this Selkirk area into Fisher River. So they ended up in Treaty 2. They're officially Treaty 5, I think. Then the events were Peguis, Selkirk. They illegally forced a vote, and it's well documented how they try to cheat them. But they pushed them out of that fertile agricultural land, which was Treaty 1 was about agriculture, and they were successful. Too much to a point where newcomers came and we can't compete with them, because as a collective, you can combine all your resources, all the money, treaty payments, and buy the modern equipment from St. Paul, Minnesota, and they'll bring it here. But there's also a warehouse that eventually there has to go to treaties and be given to you. But they've been doing agriculture in this area for a long time. They had schools way before it ended up being a promise in a treaty. But when they forced them out from the fertile land into the floodplain, they ended up in Treaty 2. So I did work for a couple of years to formulate a new government, a new model of governing based on collective rights, not individual First Nations, but collective based on treaties. And we, if they wanted to be part of it, they were invited, like Pine Creek and Gamblers and Wayway Sakapo and them. So altogether it moved from 9 to 12 collectively. And we invited the Dakota to become to our conversations, like the ones in Sioux Valley. We invited the Métis because they were our relatives, and they lived with us in our territory. Later on, they get their own little MMF regions, I guess. But this is a time of the National Indian Brotherhood when we all face the same problem. It's the government. Later on became more political bodies with Manitoba Indian Brotherhood, and then you got MMF, and you got now AMC, and so forth. But what I just wanted to say that that Treaty 2 only happened in one day. Why? Because they knew what was being said. They were present at Lower Fort Garry. They didn't sign it there. They signed it at Manitoba House. So you got Adam Archibald bringing his family, saying this is going to be done really quick. So it was a vacation. And they ended up being one of the witnesses. The family was the witnesses to that treaty. It's just that it was a mess. It had to be sorted out in a few years to come after that. But the oral traditions it was a blanket. It wasn't like we wanted townships or the 160 acres per family. They agreed for agricultural land, and they had one of the beautiful, best places to have agriculture going westward. So when they look at their territory, which is larger than Treaty 1, it was like a mat, a carpet, where everybody identify their different lands. I know that in Skowhegan we had the north, Chittick Lake going up eventually would become Treaty 5. But we go all the way to the south, we call Tootsate. I guess Fork River would be one of those boundaries, but we shared it. Westward was Ochichakasipi or Ebb and Flow, going all the way up to Lake Dauphin. But that was the body that basically had usage of that territory that's been well established before treaties was made, is the Riding Mountain bands, or the First Nations, and the Dauphin River bands, and then you got Lake Manitoba bands, and then those are by Lake Winnipeg bands. That's because you can see he became this is Manitoba map. It cuts right into Manitoba and Saskatchewan because we knew our traditional territory and its usage. But like I said, later on, it became leftovers. Oh, we forgot about you. Well, we'll put you in Treaty 2. That's well established. So Treaty 2 was signed one day on August 21, 1871 at Manitoba House, Rupert's Land, and with the representatives of the great Queen of Britain and Ireland. And there's no treaty that has Canada on it. It was with the Crown. That is why you can't have provinces that I want to break away. You can't have a municipal government that says, I am in charge of these territories. We will never allow to be municipal, even though they says, there's advantage if you're a municipal type government. And we know what happened in the United States. They use the same ploy to say, let's cut it up. Then eventually you have less land. Since that body is in the 1990s, we fought about sovereignty to this until recently, and I can't tell you enough. We have problems at home, but we get distracted by all those problems, and now we're finding little pieces of ploy. We'll give you a little bit of this, we'll give you a little bit of that, and cows and plows. And in Treaty 2, we have 17 outstanding issues, including the fact that every land that was taken up to build a park, a federal, provincial park, towns and municipal governments and lands that are taken up for property, we're down to 18% Crown land. But we never got one dime. We have the research that actually there was a business plan to say this compensation is the law from the Queen's directive. And that's been how it was talked about. Every land that we take, we're going to provide you. So it was in the form of annuities, not a treaty payment of $5. Back then it was $3, but $5. That was a gift of the Queen, but the narrative was that they called treaty payment. Never was. It wasn't our narrative. But we have treaty days. We get $5. It's a symbol of the crown that says we honor our allies, we honor our friends. And the Queen wants to make sure that we give you $5 every year. Back then in 1871, that was quite a bit. Today, people will line up for 30 minutes just to get a $5 bill. And you can't even get a Happy Meal with $5. But the symbol still remains, how important the symbol is. Because if it wasn't for treaty days and getting $5, my grandfather, and we celebrate, how would I know any of this history? They had to do it. So treaties is everything. Unfinished business. We had 17 outstanding issues that needs to be addressed, including the fact that they didn't pay us one dime for every land that they take. Treaty 1 is all complete, 100%, other than the federal and provincial parks, but it's still Treaty 1 land, unresolved. So if you're facing trillions of dollars that they owe by this treaty relationship, this compensation, and never gave it, it's no wonder they want to keep the Indian Act, because they control it all. They control Indian reserves. But I keep on saying the narrative. If you see any map, and a lot of it is up north, if you ever see a map that says Crown land, that's your land. They just put a C on it. I told my friends, you got more rights to that Crown land than you do on a little pink reserve, which is bombarded with regulations by Indian Affairs, Indian Act. Nothing to stop you from building up your communities in the way your ancestors used to do it, all over the land. Anyway, there is a lot to talk about in terms of moving forward together. And I just want to let you know that the Anishinaabeg were kind when they shared their lands with newcomers, because we're not owners, we're stewards. We knew that we were responsible for those lands, and we knew how to get along with everybody, to respect each other's territories. We knew how to make treaties, and we taught the Europeans about these treaties through Hudson Bay and many other companies. And we're also going to be kind when they say, well, here's the bill. Quite large, actually, trillions. But Canada wants to fight every legal battle in courts. But the one that they couldn't stop, it's a long time coming, is Ontario. I think that's the Lake Superior Treaty. And they won, because it's well defined with one of those court's decisions that they had earlier about a lumber company. That was documented there, was documented in terms of anything that we take from you. So if it was lumber or copper or minerals, we owe you an annuity check. And then this was put in a trust fund in the Bank of London, saved until you're ready. But if the Indian Act says that you're a ward of Canada, in other words, we haven't grown up yet to deserve our responsibility to look after ourselves, they'll never get rid of the Indian Act. All I'm just trying to say to all Canadians, it's not going to be one bill, pay it up right away. It's past due. 155 years. No. Work out some kind of agreement that in time we can live off the interest alone. We no longer want to be the most impoverished when we're supposed to be one of the equal when it comes to the natural resources in this country. But we have to deal with stereotype and racism, ignorance. And I will conclude by saying the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba is to help us all understand as Canadians that we're all treaty people. But there are still a lot of outstanding issues to address. That's why when we meet like this, And most Canadians don't know this. This is a big country after all. But you see an example of what's going on in Manitoba, the next generations that go through the school, is that the children, the next generations, are well versed in history. They already answer our future because they got information that the older generation never received, or the narrative was frozen or buried or not taught. I didn't learn anything about myself as an Anishinaabe person growing up, other than we came over from this Bering Strait bridge, I guess, and that we're hunter-gatherer society, and we're basically not part of the world history until Columbus showed up. But anyway, oral tradition goes way beyond the Ice Age, and I heard it all. It's just that the world is catching up, and they're doing it slowly. So I want to say this. All treaties are unique, but they end up being a template of agriculture. And Treaty 5 always says, why did we get an agricultural treaty when we're just basically on rock and the tundra and on swampy land? It just becomes after Treaty 1 and 2 was a peace treaty, Treaty 3 was starting to fill out in terms that eventually becomes the template to create a country to create a border to build a railroad. And that ended up being 1 to 11. So it's not a complete treaty, especially Treaty 1 and 2. They don't have access to our wealth. Just don't. So anyway, I'm just going to say, I'll open up for questions, but I'll just say in my language, it's in our ceremonies when we use these words, Akana Danawe Maganak. All my relations, miigwech, because this is who we are as Canadians. We just have to clean our house.